what you can think about, okay, the characteristics, or actually what the map can tell you. It's actually food security is very unevenly distributed. If you see the patchy patterns, it's not the same in all over the world. So some places we're facing like more problems, right? But in some other places, we're actually fine. So like when I talk about Hong Kong, we say we're actually are in a more developed region. So then actually we do not have a lot of, like if you see over here, it's actually more green color, right? So less than 5% actually facing hunger. But then in some other areas like the African, like Southern African, and in some places in Asia, actually you have higher percentage of population are still facing the problem of hunger. Right? So that's kind of, you have a food security in terms of kind of sufficient food, it actually is unevenly distributed over the world, right? And then about 95% of hunger people are actually in developing countries, because they are they will have like less resources in terms of supporting the growth. So then have more people actually facing those problems, and especially serious in sub-Sahara Africa. And then this is actually talking about potential reasons also related to the hunger. So this region actually have political instability. So we're going to discuss more later on this class. But generally, if you see the patterns, I guess you can have those certain ideas, right? So basically, unevenly distributed, and then some of the places are, have more hunger people, and that's because they are kind of in the developing state, and also the political instability may contribute to this problem. Right. So as we're talking about the hunger, we're actually talking about the calories, right? So we're comparing whether we have enough calories. But then that's kind of if we put everything on the map. But now, how about the change over time? So basically, you have this change in dietary energy and protein consumption in different regions. So you have these two figures. On the left-hand side, we are talking about the energy, right? In terms of cows, cows actually per day per person, and then on the right hand side we're talking about protein intake. So in terms of gram per day per person, and then on the x-axis actually the time. So from 1960 to 2010, or maybe 2015. So you can see in both figures. I guess if we focus on the world status first, so the world trend for the energy, dietary energy and protein consumption, so the intake individual level is actually increasing, right? From this 1960 level to 2015, you can see a nice increasing trend. But then at the same time, I guess you recognize, so those different lines, they represent different regions. So in some areas, if you see those kind of least developed countries, they will have much lower level than the world average. And of course, you have those kind of North American that's representative of the developed countries. That actually you have a much higher, increase or a much higher value than the world average. And for the least developed country, if you compare those lines, actually, even at 2015 level, they're still much lower, than the 1960s level for a lot of these developed countries. So that's actually indicates you have this very unevenly, distribution lines as well. So you have this difference in different countries. But in general, in most of the places, you all observe this kind of increasing trend. So that's kind of indicate we have this increase. So things are actually getting better in terms of this kind of energy consumption. So we have this more resources, and actually we have increased level of energy and protein intake. Okay, although we have this uneven distribution in terms of resources and then the energy protein consumption levels. So that's actually, we're talking about the general trend, and then that's all based on energy intake. Right? So we're talking about the calories. But at the same time, in terms of hunger index, so if we want to evaluate the potential security, sufficient food, or maybe the resources is not the only thing we take into consideration. So in terms of global hunger index, actually we want to take several other parameters that into consideration. Okay, that's the global hunger index. Actually, we also want to consider the children. So they will be the most vulnerable population or most vulnerable groups in the community. Of course, we are talking about the prevalence of the undernourishment. So that's actually when we discuss this sort of status, we mostly based on this kind of prevalence of undernourishment. But for the global hunger index, we're also taking consideration the children stunting rate, wasting rate, or their mortality rate. So the vulnerable community, how they respond to this kind of lacking of food resources. Okay, so the undernourishment actually were already discussed. So we try to measure the inadequate food access to say whether we can provide enough calorie to support that community, right? So that's referred to the entire community. So we actually quantify the whole region, and as I say, it's actually used as a lead indicator for the international hunger reduction target. And then for the children status, so for the stunting and wasting, is actually we reflect the children's vulnerability. Right? So basically, they are, as I said, they are the most vulnerable groups in the population, and they are very sensitive to uneven distribution of food within the household. So actually, we use that, taking that into consideration. And mortality is kind of the death rate, basically, for the children death rate. That's actually the most serious consequence of hunger. So they cannot, for example, they cannot have enough food. So and then they have these problems in their development, physiology, and eventually this may lead to the death of children. So that's kind of taken into consideration as the most serious consequence. So we're actually taking that into consideration when we calculate the global hunger index as well. And then I guess you can see in terms of these calculations. So when we try to take those into consideration, if you think about we want to compare different regions, right? So we have actually quite a lot of data from different regions, and how can we standardize those values and then compare the conditions for different regions. We actually have to do this kind of standardization first in this kind of calculations. And if you think about the values at the bottom over here, right? So actually, you may have the question why we want to divide those values into like divided by 80, and why is it kind of 70 here? That will be the high value, or the highest value over the global conditions. So for example, in terms of prevalence of undernourishment, 80% of those population is under nourishment. That's already a very high risk, right? So it's actually a very high prevalence, and we actually develop kind of standardize that into how serious this condition compared to other regions. Okay, so for example, in some regions they have this big problem, and they have like 79 prevalence of undernourishment, and then we actually dividing that level. So we know they actually have a high relative seriousness of this prevalence in that country, and some other country may have just 5%, and then you over 80. So relatively, you can compare the two places. And also for the stunting rate or wasting rate, it also have this kind of high values. So 70% is actually stunting, or 30% wasting is already a very high value for those kind of weights. Okay, so that's kind of, you do the standardization first, and then you put those values together. So undernourishment, so if you get the value, you kind of divide that by 3. And then for the children stunting and wasting, they actually count as like 1/6 into this factor And then mortality, that's also a very serious condition. So we actually taken that factor to basically count that as 1/3 into the final GHI score. Okay, so once you have this GHI score, actually we have certain scale over here. And then if we have a GHI score less than 9.9, we actually think this have this low severity. But if we have a high level, like over 50, actually we think you have a kind of extremely alarming scores over there. Okay, so that's kind of if we know, the rate of prevalence, if we know the rate of stunting, wasting, and mortality, how we can put those rates into one single factor, and then we can compare with different regions, and also we can have a overall estimate of the global hunger. So the overall estimate of the severity of hunger in that specific region. Okay. So for that sort of thing, do you have any questions? So for that kind of global hunger, that's how to do the calculation, and how can we get those kind of one single factor to compare between regions or to understand the severity of hunger? No questions. Okay. Right. So actually, I want to show you some of the facts and figures about hunger. So if you think about in terms of the world population, what's the percentage of world population actually facing hunger problems? I guess you can have a guess in your mind. What's the percentage that actually having this problem? Is this actually from old data? So a few years ago. So I guess they have this kind of update every year, but the percentage is actually quite close. So what would be the percentage in mind, you think? So you can see whether you have the right estimate, or maybe this number will surprise you. Certainly not 100%, right? Any idea? I mean, you can have a guess.
Maybe 30%.
Maybe 30%. Okay, it's actually you have a more estimate. So it's actually less than 10%. Okay, population. But if you think about the numbers, it's actually quite large. Right? So 690 million people is actually more than the population of Hong Kong. Right? In Hong Kong, you may have how many? Like 6 million or something? Or maybe 7 million? Oh, sorry. Yeah, about 600 million here. And then the majority of the world's 100 people is actually half of those 100 people in Asia. So we actually see the map, right? So when we actually introduce this kind of hunger idea, so we see the map. Actually, you have these large numbers in both Asia and Africa. So that's actually considered the most serious problems place. We're actually talking about this undernourishment and hunger problems. 1/10 people in the world exposed to severe level of food insecurity. So this is actually not considered just the hunger problem, but also other safety and nutrition levels. That's actually taken more into consideration. 2 billion people do not have regular access to safe, nutritious, and sufficient food in 2019. Okay, so that's actually a very big number. So we actually have like 1/5 or maybe 1/6 of actually world population do not have those kind of regular access to this kind of secure, so do not have the security basically. And then we're talking about the children's, right? So the most vulnerable groups. So actually, the children under 5, 144 million children under 5 affected by stunting, and 3/4 living in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. So that still will be the most severely hit places. And then about 6.9% affected by wasting or acute undernutrition. Okay, so that's actually some of the figures I want to show you in terms of this kind of world hunger status. So then you can have a better understanding of the general data in the world. Okay. So if you think about the global hunger index, actually we put that in the map here, so you can compare that with the first map I show you. So in terms of the undernourishment, it actually sees similar patterns, right? So basically, you have certain areas where you have more alarming status than certain, like some other areas where you have a low GHI. So that indicates a higher food security in those regions. Okay, so it's actually a comparing different countries, different places. And this is a more updated data to like 2023. Okay, right. And then I guess we can introduce the idea of zero hunger by 2030. I guess this is, although it's a target, and let's say whether we can meet that in 4 years' time, okay? But I guess it will be quite challenging. So that's why people are still fighting and trying to reach that and trying to do a lot of things to achieve it. So for the zero hunger is that we want to end hunger and ensure access by all people, and especially those vulnerable populations. And also we want to end all forms of malnutrition. What we'll actually talk about will be the malnutrition later on, but it's actually will be quite challenging to do. And also for those kind of stages, so for both all forms of malnutrition, we're actually also talking about the children, because those will be quite important for the children, since they need to have a lot of nutrients to support their growth and development. So they will be quite vulnerable in terms in the population, and also for the pregnant and lactating women, they are also will be considered as the more vulnerable populations of in the community. So that's actually some more detailed in relating to detailed targets in relating to zero hunger. So if we want to end hunger and ensure access by all people, and if we want to end all forms of malnutrition, we actually need to think about our agriculture production and the food sustainability in terms of food production and then the distribution, and also we're trying to maintain the genetic diversity. Right? So basically we're talking about biodiversity. That's what would be also quite important in increasing the food security over the world. Okay. So I'm not going to read through all those heavy texts, but you have that in the PDF uploaded to Canvas, so you can actually have like detailed reading after class. Okay. Right. So this is a prevalence of undernourishment. So actually you can see we try to introduce, it's actually try to reinforce the idea. So in terms of a more close-up, actually I show you some of the figures from 1960s to now in terms of kind of calorie intake or protein intake. And this one for the global hunger, like prevalence of undernourishment, is actually we're talking about 205 to 2020. So what would be the change? And if you think about our targets for the zero hunger, how close or how well we're doing in terms of achieving that goal, okay? So if you think about the target we have now, between 700 to 800 million people actually in the world still face hunger in 2021. So if you see the data over here, okay, so we actually have a nice decreasing trend if you think about from 2005 to about 2010 or 2018, something like that. We have a nice decreasing trend, you can see. if you think about the number of undernourished people, so in the gray lines over here, right, so that's actually the data. And then if you see the orange ones, that would be the prevalence of undernourishment in terms of their percentage. We actually have like 12% actually undernourishment, and towards 2018, that's about maybe 8%. So actually have this great decreasing. But then you can see after, so actually this is after COVID, right? So we have remembered COVID-19. So end of 19 and then 20, as you can see, those, this kind of pandemic actually increase the level of undernourishment, like in the world, right? So basically you have this increasing of undernourished people, and also the percentage from less than 8% to 9 and 10% actually have this increasing trend, right? So we actually are affected by those kind of pandemic. So this is actually contributing into this undernourishment, increasing of undernourishment percentage, and actually drag us like farther away from the zero hunger like target, right? So some of the data, right, hunger affected 46 million more people in 2021 compared to 2020. And actually those numbers, if you think about, we'll discuss some other factors that may have like continuously increased over the past few years. Okay, so that's kind of the potential impact of COVID-19, not just hitting the population in like a lot of different aspects. Actually, in terms of this undernourishment or status, they also have a very bad impact. And those, in terms of regions, it's actually more than half of the people in the world affected hunger in 2021. So it's the impact of COVID-19 will still be in Asia. So those people who actually are hit more, and more than 1/3 in Africa. So those areas we already know that we have this kind of global hunger problems. They are actually more impacted by the COVID-19 in terms of those kind of undernourishment status. Okay, so that's kind of some data indicating the impacts over here. And then, why are there so many hungry people actually? So we discussed some of the factors. If you think about the areas where you have this kind of more hunger problems and the distribution over the global map, I guess you can recognize some of those like climate or the conflict in terms of like political instability, they may contribute into these hunger problems, right? So the pandemic actually also pose additional threat to the food system. So then actually those people will have less access to food, right? So that's kind of a contributing factor. Civil insecurity and declining food production. If you think about over the pandemic, you also have some impact on the food production and transportation, right? Because a lot of the lockdown event happening, so those actually will also contribute into this kind of hunger problems, right? So those actually the people in those less developed regions or least developed regions, they were having a more problem because they might relying on the help from the others. So they actually have a more difficulty in getting food resources. So having faced this food scarcity and also the high food prices. For the rich people, they may still be able to pay, but for the poor people, they actually may not have the ability to pay for the high food prices. Okay, that's actually okay. So in terms of this kind of, if we have a lot of hunger people, actually we're talking about famines, so large-scale food shortage, and with widespread starvation and social disruptions. And normally for the famines over history, and they can trigger by climate problems, drought or flood, so actually destroy the agriculture production. and then is also linked with the political instability. So if you think about if we have a more sustained civil system, and then if certain area they have drought and flood, then potentially they can receive certain help from the close regions. But if in the place you have already political instability, then the condition will getting worse. So basically, you have this root cause of severe food insecurity and also include political instability, such as wars or some other important issues. Economic disparities, that's kind of for the rich and poor people, whether they have kind of resources, so it may drive the peasants from their land. And then farmings, they might trigger mass migration. So from one place from their land for the peasants, drive the peasants from their lands to the relief camp so they can receive certain helps. But for people actually living in that conditions, they can try to survive to get some resources, but it will be difficult for them to maintain a healthy and productive life. Right? So basically, it'll be kind of hurts their development. And now, if you think about, we're talking about this kind of potential political instability or wars, what kind of pressures they may impose onto this kind of world food production or the transportation systems. Now you can think about what are the potential risks of the war in Ukraine. So it actually happened so several years already. I guess you have some ideas. And then what their impacts or risk for the international agriculture market and global food security. So I guess I can give you some simple questions so you can have a general thinking. So how would world food supply change? So if you think about if you have a war somewhere, a big war that lasts for years, and how would world food supply change? It will be decreased, right? It will be decreasing because of certain regions they're actually on the war, so then they have less ability in terms of production, right? So agriculture production. And now, of course, you might also change the resources or the types of kind of food supply. But kind of if you think about the some food is actually from Ukraine or maybe from Russia, and those food you have to import from other regions. So you may have this kind of change of structures. In terms of number of undernourished people, if we have like widely impact wars, what might happen? You might have this increase, like what we observe, like if you have like COVID-19 or this kind of impacts, actually may have this number of undernourished people increasing. And if you have the wars, actually, because we have the food supply decrease, potentially we may impact on the resources that can supply to a certain region, right? Then actually you may have increased number of undernourished people, and who would suffer the most? From our previous discussion, like several impacts on the world undernourished status, who would suffer the most actually? Of course, the people in those countries will suffer, but other than that, who would suffer most? Yes? Yeah, so basically we're talking about, comparatively, actually those, like this developed country or the less developed country, those poor people, actually they will suffer most, right? So as I say, we have this kind of unevenly distributed in terms of food resources and then in terms of food prices to pay, right? If you have this decline of food supply, potentially increase the food prices, right, in the market. And then for the poor people, they actually will suffer because we might not have the resources to pay for that. So I'll give you some of the data. So for the war in Ukraine, it's actually, in terms of food supply from those countries, Ukraine and Russia, they actually supply like 30% of wheat, 20% of maize, and 80% of sunflower seed products. So it's actually a large proportion if you think about in terms of this kind of global export. So there will be a large disturbance in the global food markets or the agricultural products because of the war in those two countries, right? So those kind of exportation, production will be highly hit by those kind of war activities. And this is actually an estimated impact of the war in Ukraine of the global number of undernourished people. So basically, we have those different scenarios. You can find some more updated data. So this is actually from the estimate, but you can compare that with the more realistic data nowadays to see which scenarios actually we're falling at the moment. So you can see when we have this kind of conditions, so we have this instability due to the war, potentially you have this increasing number of undernourished people in the world population, and actually they will trigger food shortage for the worst poorest people because they actually have the least resources to maintain their life standards and also to in response to this kind of instability. And then you can see this actually from last year, 3 years into the war, 1/3 of population in frontline regions struggle to find enough to eat. Right? So this is actually some reality there. So if we have the wars, actually you have a large impact. I want to quickly show you of this. Right, this is actually all right. So none of the videos actually work. So basically, that's actually talking about the impacts of war. So to the South Africa. So basically, in making them actually shortage of food supply to their population. So it's not just happening in the kind of the poor country. People actually suffer, but actually those people relying on their food supply are also suffer because of the shortage. Okay, in terms of what why should we care about what happens far away about the world food insecurity in other places? As I say, in Hong Kong, we actually have a more more or less a good standard for food security, right? Why should we care? Actually, if you think about our families, we want our families to have enough food, right? So this kind of you try to help others as well as we want most people actually they want to have safe and nutritious food. So that's actually a general or a more basic like human feeling. So we want something good for others, and then for the if we think about larger impact, if we have a world with zero hunger, they actually can positively impact our economies. That because we can put resources into other aspect, right? So we can put more resources in terms of developing the health, education, equality, or social development. So we actually can distribute the resources to other aspects that can be good for everyone. And also will not be, so with hunger limiting human development, then we will not be able to achieve other sustainable development goals. If you think about the other development goals, we have this kind of, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and actually this one has been placed in UST like a few years ago, and then you can see the dots there would be from the peers in the UST, so students or staff in UST, they will see which of the ones they want to contribute to and which would be the ones that's quite important. And I can see zero hunger is here, the number 2. So actually a lot of people are actually focusing on that. And if you think about those, so 14, you can see a lot of those like life below water. So we're actually talking about biodiversity, right? So I was quite glad to see a lot of people are also caring about those things. Okay, so that's kind of some of the voting from the UST peers. So I can see actually they are taking those into sustainable development goals into consideration, which is a very nice thing. Okay. Right, so that's actually something we talk about the hunger issues. So factor is related to sufficient food, whether we have sufficient food to support the community. And then in terms of nutritious food, so whether we can have the nutrition, access to the nutrition from the food, actually we need to think about what food do we need in terms of maintaining our health status, right? So we have to think about the right nutrients actually we can get from the food. If we do not have the right nutrients, potentially still have this undernutrition. So if you think about like lack, so basically the first figure over here. So these children actually they lack protein and calories. So we're talking about undernourishment, right? So that's kind of the first step. If we do not have those enough protein and calories, and potentially undernourishment, and for the people, they cannot develop into the right standards. Right? So they may have stunting or wasting. So that's actually bad for their health, and then they may lead to like early deaths, right, because of that. Right? So starving to death is possible, right? And but if we have certain deficiencies for certain nutrients, or maybe certain trace metals, like certain like micronutrients, then potentially we may have certain symptoms. And also bad, for example, if we have iodine deficiencies, potentially you may develop certain symptoms like the goiter over here. Right, so that's actually, you may have imbalances caused by a lack of specific nutrients. Right, so that's kind of, we have to get the right nutrients. And undernourishment, we're not just talking about the kind of the undernutrition. So basically, it's not just the deficiency of energy. So we may have vitamins or minerals taken into consideration as kind of undernutrition. That's kind of a result of inadequate intake of food in terms of quantity and quality. And then it may result from a range of underlying factors, including like household food insecurity. That's kind of whether you can get continuous access to a diverse food, so then you can receive all the nutrients you need. It may also relate to kind of the maternal health, children practices, so it's kind of related to their education, access to health services, so that when they have certain symptoms or lack of certain nutrients, they can be identified very early, so then they can have certain preventions, and also safe water and sanitation. That's kind of undernutrition. For the malnourishment, undernutrition is certainly one of them, so lacking of certain nutrients, but problems overnutrition is also one type of this malnourishment. So that's caused by unbalanced diet, and it might kind of related to consuming too many calories in relation to requirements. So basically, for the nutritious food intake, we want to be more balanced, so not undernutrition and also not like overnutrition. Okay, so if you think about the overnutrition, remember the calorie of the food, the protein intake. I show you like early on in this course. You can see the difference in terms of different countries, different areas, and also their trend of increasing. So it's actually you can try to connect that figure with this one. So the percentage of overweight over here. So we have several different countries listed on your left-hand side, and then you have this x-axis actually is the percentage of overweight, and then we have actually different years. So for the red bars, that's underweight. So that's actually an indication of undernourishment, right? So basically, they may not have enough, and then therefore they have this kind of underweight. So it's kind of as an indicator for undernourishment. And then for the overweight, they're actually colored in this darker or light blue bars. For the darker ones, that's the data from 2015, and then the lighter bars will be 1960, so very early years. So you can see for developed countries like United States, United Kingdoms, you can see in the 210, so the underweight is actually data from 210, you actually have very small numbers of underweight people, right? So basically, last percentage maybe less than 5%, or actually less than 10% if I do the maximum. And then for like some Asian countries, India, they actually in 2010 they still have about 30 something underweight people. So that's kind of indicating of certain, the undernourishment in the population. Okay, in 2010, and as you can see, focusing on the 1960 data, so the light blue bars, you can see India is actually have very small percentage that under kind of overweight, so maybe 2 or 3%. In China, it's also very low, like 5%. And then you can see towards a more developed place. In 1960, remember that's actually quite many years ago, you already have a relatively high proportion of overweight percentage. Like in United States in 1960, that's already more than 40% overweight. Okay, and then in 2015, that number is actually increasing in most of the countries. So you can see in most places you have this increasing of overweight percentage. Although in the Asian countries they're still lower, so maybe 20%, but then in those kind of more developed places, there will be like over 60%. Is actually a very high number. So that's actually leading to a problem as well. So for those like overweight people that may have this kind of obesity epidemic, right? So that's kind of a symptom of also a food insecurity. So basically, they may eat a lot of fast food. So that's kind of related to that, so contributing to the potential over eating and also this kind of epidemic. And that's for those kind of, if fast food eating, then potentially have the high calorie, low nutrient food. So they may be cheaper than freshly made food. So then actually if people taking those kind of very high energy foods, that may contributing to the overweight problems. And if they have continuously have these overweight problems, they may increasing the risk for getting obesity or maybe the heart problems. Okay. So that's kind of overeating is a growing world problems in almost all countries. Okay. Right. So in terms of the nutrients, so what kind of nutrients do we need from the food? Is actually we think about vitamins. So we have certain essential vitamins, some of the minerals. We're talking about this magnesium, calcium, phosphorus, so this kind of, and also the trace metals. If you think about iron, selenium, zinc. So people, when they lack certain trace nutrients, actually the doctors may provide certain supplements to help increasing the level. Proteins is certainly very important from the food. So we actually taking that, the proteins and calories, and were the major things we want to get our food. The fat, they actually kind of contain like 20 to 35% daily calories. Water is also quite important, and carbohydrates, sugar or starch. These actually are the essential nutrients we want to get from our food. And then in terms of what would be our food, so where are the supply or where are the sources of those nutrients? So we may think about certain grasses, root crops, vegetables, like domestic fowl and then fish species. And then for a lot of people, actually rice quite important. So for 5 billion people in developing countries, they're actually relying on rice supply. For the commodity crops, corn and soil, they actually are quite important, like species, because they kind of use in a lot of things, sweeteners, corn oil, and some other like ingredients. So in terms of what would be a more balanced or sustainable supply of food in our daily life, this is actually something raised in the it's actually the Harvard University. So they actually give some idea if we have supply of different food, what proportion or what should we have to maintain a more balanced balanced nutrient supply. But this kind of course, may have different kind of suggestions, styles, but this could be taken into consideration where you have a lot of exercise, so daily exercise and weight control at the bottom. So that would be need to take it into consideration if you want to maintain a more, healthy or more standard status. Okay, and then we actually want to take quite a lot of the like whole grains and then vegetable fruits that actually considered to be at the base of this pyramid. So at the bottom, actually the ones we want to take more, and then on top of this, there will be the fat and oil supply, and then the protein supply. So on the top, you can see for some of these meats, like red meat, processed meat, and butter, those kind of things, the recommendation would be used marginally. And then for the bottom, actually, they can be the most the higher supply to the food supply to our daily life. So they have a strong emphasis on those kind of fruit and vegetable and whole grains as the basis of those kind of healthy diet. Okay. Right, so that's kind of the Harvard Food Pyramid. So basically, they were thinking about the nutritious level of different kinds of food, and then what we actually need to take and consume, and then to maintain the more balanced, healthy status into consideration. And if you think about the meat supplies, actually they can be a good indicator in terms of this wealth. So basically the increase of wealth globally. If you see these kind of meat consumption trend, you can see we have these two figures over there. So one would be actually on your left-hand side, that would be the types of meat in terms of millions terms, and then you have the years actually at the bottom. Then you can see for different types of meat, you can see over the years, you have this kind of supply or production over the year. So that actually means we have generally we have a more meat supply. And if you think about per capita consumption, there's actually, we have different countries over here. And then over the years, you can see in terms of in those different countries, if you think about the world average over here, you have this increasing trend in terms of meat consumption, right? So that's kind of, you have this connection in terms of their global trends of this kind of meat consumption over the years and also in different countries. And then, of course, you have certain differences, like in Asia or Africa, you still have this kind of low consumption, per capita consumption. But for those like Europe or more like North American or developed countries, where you have this relatively higher consumption of meat, that's actually also indicates, the levels of wealth in those different countries. And one of the reasons for that is actually meat actually quite expensive to produce. Okay, so this actually why they can serve as a good indicator in terms of wealth, and also show we actually have a more kind of a better status in terms of providing resources to different countries. And of course, the increase of those kind of meat consumption is also related to the population growth, because you have more people to feed, then you need to have more resources related to that. Okay. So for when we're talking about meat are expensive to produce, we actually are talking about different resources we want to throw into this production industry. So one of the important things, if you think about the land use per kilogram of food products, now you can see like we have this kind of meat actually at the top, where you have lamb, mutton, or beef. You can see they actually require large land area in terms of producing 1 kilogram of meat from those. Right, so it's kind of 369 for the lamb, and then for beef, like 326. So if you compare, with the other species like fish, farm fish is actually 8, and then you have rice or fruits is actually required maybe for tomatoes 0.8 square meters. So you can see you have this very big difference in terms of land use, right? And then also, if you think about, we need to feed, the animals to, for the meat supply. And then if you think about the number of kilograms of grain needed to produce 1 kilogram of bread, so we have bread as here as a control, and then compared to 1 kilogram of other meat supply. So if you can see, like for the beef, actually you need much higher grains in terms of producing. That's kind of 1 kilograms of live weight grain. So basically, you have differences in terms of resources you want to put in for the meat supply. So that's kind of some indicator for it's kind of expensive to produce meat. And for the other side, it's not just the resources. We also want to think about the climate. Right, so in terms of greenhouse gas emissions associated with different food products, if you think about per kilogram, so if you see we have three graphs here. The first one will be per kilogram of products. And then for B would be per 100 gram of protein. So in terms of producing 100 grams of protein, and third one would be per gram of product without missing. Then you can see for generally for beef, they actually have a relatively high number of average greenhouse gas emissions. So actually quantify the potential impact of certain meat production and link that with potential the climate. So you see these high levels of greenhouse gas emission. So in terms of CO2 equivalent. Okay, so that's kind of something people also want to take into consideration when they think about, in terms of how expensive to produce meat. Right, so that's kind of why people raise this idea to eat less meat. So that's maybe some mitigation for climate change, and kind of diet-related things related to the climate change. I just want you to take that into consideration, but it's also something linked with kind of climate development. Okay. So that's actually we're using meat as an example to say, okay, we still have this like kind of unevenly distributed food resources, but generally we actually have a better wealth in most countries, and they have this increasing supply for meat. And also we're talking about whether the production, what kind of resources and what potential impact relating to the agricultural food supply. So now we can try to think about, so how can we improve global food security? Okay, so the question is, do we need more production of food? Or is there actually an absolute need to increase the production of food? Yes. Okay, so actually for the zero hunger, if you remember in the zero hunger targets, it's actually mentioned something to say we want to increase the agriculture production. But it's actually for this question, it will be yes and no. Because, if you think about the food production in different areas, in different countries, actually in some places, we already have a very high supply, yes? Okay, that's great. So we can increase the food preservation, right? So that's sort of we want to decrease the food waste. Okay, so that's actually will. So basically, if it's considered, the production over the global Earth, so basically in different regions, actually we already have a very high food supply, especially for those developed countries. But the problem is whether we can use all of those food. So preservation, if we increase the preservation, potentially we may be able to transport, the used food to other places. So then we can decrease the food waste. So actually that will be very good. So I actually want to put it here. So okay, so in some countries, the less developed places, maybe we want to increase the production, but it's not as does not necessarily reduce hunger. If you think about, we might want to better use and distribute our food resources over the global place. And then global kind of food waste is also a big problem. So we want to increase the preservation, and then we want to reduce the waste of food, so then we can better use those resources. And the other one is actually international financial speculation. I want to put it there because I think we do not think about that too much. Actually, if you think about if they actually in the economic markets, if they do this kind of financial markets, they try to betting on the food prices, that actually will increase certain instability of the food market. So they will actually causing some problems in terms of getting a more balanced food supply. That's will also causing a problems in terms of decreasing the food security, and that's why actually in some areas like EU, they agreed to introduce new rules to prevent this kind of hedge funds and investment banks from driving up food prices, because we want to have a more stable, the prices in the food market, so that we can increase the security globally. Okay. So that's kind of related to the production of food. Okay, another thing is actually for the biofuel production, this may contribute in terms of using food resources to other use. So we can also take that into consideration. Okay, and then the question is, do we need more farmland? I guess if we do not necessarily need to increase the food production, then of course for the farmland, I guess we do not need to increase too much of the farmland, but what we need to do is to protect the current conditions. So like it's actually related to the previous question, right? So if we produce more than enough food to feed the world, then potentially we do not need to increase our farmland. And another reason for not disturbing or creating too many farmland, there's another reason related to what we discussed before in terms of habitat destruction. Remember, so some of the ecological functions of different land resources. If you think about some of these like rainforest, they may not be suitable to convert to a farmland, right? So they may have certain problems. They have their specific niche. Remember, so they may not be good, may not be suitable for crops, and also they may have very important ecological functions we don't want to disturb. Right? So basically, we want to keep their ecological functions and then to keep our biodiversity and also the ecosystem balance in those kind of different land resources. So not converting them or protect them, not converting them to like farmland. But at the same time, we may want to increase the, to use the farmland more efficiently. And then maybe we need to think about for like the same area of farmland, how can we increase the potential, the productivity, right? So that's actually something we want to discuss in our next class. So we're actually talking about modern agriculture in our next class. Okay, do you have any questions related to today's content? Okay, if there's no question, I'll see you on Thursday. Okay.